Hello, I'm Helen Dampier, Senior Lecturer in History at Leeds Beckett University, and our talk today is on humanitarian handicrafts, and in particular, the Boer home industries schools founded by Emily Hobhouse in South Africa at the beginning of the 20th century. Our interest in textile history arises from a research project on the British peace activist and relief worker Emily Hobhouse, whose dates are 1860 to 1926, and her attempt to establish the Boer Home Industries Scheme as an act of peacemaking between Boer and Britons in South Africa after the South African War of 1899 to 1902. Hobhouse herself referred to this as weaving the web of peace. I come to this topic as a historian of South African history, and my colleague Rebecca Gill, a historian at the University of Huddersfield, who'll be speaking with me, is a historian of humanitarianism. This talk arises from a growing mutual interest in the history of humanitarian handicrafts, particularly the role of textiles in schemes of aid and development in the aftermath of war. Nowadays, it's possible to walk into any Oxfam shop and be faced with a plethora of different textiles from around the world for sale, to support post-conflict development schemes or alleviate poverty. You can see some of these textiles on the slide. We're interested in finding out more about the historical roots of these types of schemes, what the thinking was behind them, and who participated in them and why. Emily Hobhouse's textile schools were but one example of a whole range of similar projects in Ireland, for instance, or in France during the First World War. But it provides a fascinating account of ideas that seem to be common to all of them, whether about the importance of preserving a national culture and traditional skill, providing women and girls with occupation and preventing moral decline, or creating new sources of independence and self-sufficiency in wartime or after war. We've been fortunate to be able to trace the history of Emily Hobhouse's scheme through her extensive correspondence with her friends and associates in South Africa, with whom she worked to set up the Boer Home Industries schools, including a school dedicated to the teaching and production of lace. We've come to be fascinated by the examples of lace, tweed, and other textiles produced by Hobhouse's scheme and their political context. These textiles are stored in the National Museum in Bloemfontein in the Free State in South Africa, not now on public display. We were fortunate to meet the curator who was able to show us the textiles, and we took some photographs, such as the ones on the slide. In our paper here, we'll be delving into the origins and development of Hobhouse's lace school in South Africa in particular, but we'll begin by situating this within her wider home industries project.
In the aftermath of the South African War, Hobhouse set about establishing domestic textile industries, her home industry scheme, which aimed to replace essential household goods lost in the war and to weave together the fabric of a new South African society founded on self-reliance, cooperation and autonomy. The scheme focused on setting up schools for instructing Boer women and girls in spinning and weaving. The lace-making school followed later and was aimed at alleviating poverty in Boer, primarily rural communities devastated by the war. The Boers were the descendants of white Dutch farmers who had settled in South Africa in the 17th century. By the late 19th century, there were two Boer states in South Africa, the Free State and the Transvaal. The British also had two colonies in South Africa by this time, Cape Colony and Natal. In 1899 to 1902, the Boers and British had gone to war, largely over economic control of the newly found gold mines in South Africa. The Boers had been defeated eventually after a guerrilla war, and the British Empire absorbed the two Boer states into the British Empire. Emily Hobhouse had first come to prominence during the war for her exposure of conditions in British-run concentration camps for Boer women and children whose menfolk were on commando. In doing so, she had been denounced as a traitor by the British press, but accorded heroine status by the Boers. This witnessing of the domestic turmoil of war and the suffering of women and children had turned Hobhouse into a convinced pacifist. She spent her remaining years until her death in 1926 campaigning for peace and attempting to provide relief and public visibilities to civilians who had suffered in war through model development schemes such as the Boer home industries and through publishing the testimony of those women who had been placed into the concentration camps. This became her life's work. In South Africa, she wished to not only provide occupation to the young women affected by the war, but also to build bridges of peace between the Boer population and the Britons who lived in South Africa in acts of reconciliation. Thus, she hoped that the values of trust, cooperation, and the nobility of labour were to be revived with each yard of arduously spun cloth. Like Quakers, with whom she worked alongside in the home industry schools, the point was not simply material provision, but also personal connection and shared feeling. Ultimately, she wished to see the Boers gain their freedom from the British Empire and become an independent republic. Hobhouse's vision for the scheme was one that equated industriousness with dignity and moral fibre, material self-sufficiency with the virtues of independence. The question for South Africa was what form this independence would take. Would it give equal citizenship to all, irrespective of gender or of race? Or would independence also mean Black South Africans were excluded from political power? These questions form the political background of Hobhouse's work in South Africa, with some, such as her friend Olive Schreiner, arguing that a new independent South Africa should not segregate the races and that all should have the vote, and with others, such as Hobhouse's friend Mrs. Steyn, wife of the former president of the Free State Martin Steyn, supporting the creation of a new South African nation, which would be racially exclusive and be governed by and for white Boers only.
We're interested in Hobhouse's moral and political conceptualization of the scheme. For example, it is clear from her letters that the exclusion of Black people from the home industry scheme was taken for granted. It was certainly not discussed or explained, and Black people mainly appear in her letters as servants. You can see in this letter that she wrote in 1908, something of the racial politics involved. Boys and girls swarm about with nothing to do. Their interest in the details of the work is extreme, and they come and poke their black faces into the loom, trying to understand the warp. They're like children or pet animals about the place, alternately petted or scolded, taking an interest in all that goes on and doing everything badly. Part of our project has been to attempt to place these attitudes to race within the context of cultural nationalism in South Africa at this time. In other words, to understand the way in which culture supported the creation of a new nation and gave it its identity, the better to understand her racial politics, and also the racial politics of her wider liberal circles, as policies of segregation were being discussed and were unfolding. In terms of the specifics of the textile designs produced by Hobhouse's scheme, we're piecing together the practicalities of production and the symbolism of the designs chosen from photographs such as these, which shows the spinning and weaving school at Philippolis in the Free State. We know that Hobhouse arranged for old-fashioned spinning wheels that you can see to be donated to the scheme from Europe, and we know that Hobhouse encouraged the use of natural dyes, with some Boer women involved in the schools sent out onto the veldt to gather plants and roots to produce these dyes. Obviously, there was a sense in which Hobhouse and her South African supporters, chief among them the aforementioned Mrs. Steyn, wished to create a textile heritage which was rooted in the South African climate and its fauna and flora, and made by South African hands. It was to be a distinctly South African textile, authentic, irreplaceable, and born of both time and place. Here is a jacket made for Hobhouse's Quaker assistant in South Africa, Margaret Clark Gillett, daughter of the well-known Clark family of shoe manufacturers. You'll see that it's made of undyed wool, hand-spun and hand-sewn. Certainly, we might say Margaret Clark wore her ethics on her sleeve. Having set up the scheme in 1905, Hobhouse then left South Africa to return to Britain in 1908, at a time when the future of South Africa was being negotiated with a view to a union of the 4 colonies of South Africa, following the transfer of power from London to Pretoria in 1905. South African politicians, writers, and public figures were involved in debating what the new united South Africa would look like, and particularly whether Black South Africans should have the vote. In the end, it was decided that they would not, and this was the beginning of greater racial segregation. At this point, the Hobhouse's schools were handed over to government control as part of the newly formed Department for Education.
So we are interested in the invention of a distinctly Boer aesthetic and how this was created. We can observe how Hobhouse attempted to blend old European modes of production and imagery, for instance using hand spinning and bobbin lace making, skills now increasingly obsolete in a European context, with something indigenous to Boer traditions. In 1910, the South African colonies formed into a union. The South African president, Jan Smuts, was both an idealist and a pragmatist. He wanted South Africa to have independence, but knew also the importance of maintaining good relations with the British Empire. Thus, Smuts was aware of the importance of signaling his identity, proud of being a South African, but also not wanting to offend the British. His Boer home industry suit could do much of the talking for him. Hobhouse, however, would hear nothing of his complaints that it was itchy. General Smuts, she said, has been wearing his suit that says he feels like a female ostrich in it. The men are too silly, they have never worn tweed and can't somehow feel at home in it. In reality, they all look extremely handsome in it, which I go about telling them all day long, and I know it's comfortable because I wear it myself. But they insist it scratches their skin. Quite absurd, you know. So it is worn in the Transvaal as a patriotic duty with very bad grace, far different from the Cape, where even the editor of the Cape Times walks proudly about, preening himself and saying, "I am dressed in Boer tweed." The story of Emily Hobhouse's attempt to create a South African lace school is an intriguing, though perhaps less well-known aspect of her work in South Africa. It is this to which we are now going to turn. In fact, it was lace making that was Hobhouse's initial intention with the Home Industries project, as she recalled in her unpublished draft memoir, Now in the Bodleian, where the word they here refers to Boer women. I knew they had skill with the needle, and I had detected it here and there, a latent sense of art. They appeared to cling to home and family life, and time was theirs in abundance. This tranquil existence combined with brilliant skies all helped to suggest lace making. While researching lace production in Ireland, however, Hobhouse had been advised by Alice Stopford Green to focus on spinning and weaving instead, especially as this would enable Boer women to make use of wool produced on South African farms. Yet after the spinning and weaving schools passed into government control, Hobhouse revived her idea of lace making in South Africa. By 1909, the idea for a school to produce lace on the De Wet farm had taken root. After having spent a year in Italy learning lace production with a young Boer woman called Johanna Root, Hobhouse recruited Root to oversee the running of the school. While in Italy, Hobhouse made contact with the De Vito De Marco family and requested that one of the daughters, Lucia Storace, go to South Africa to train young girls in lace production. The lace schools represented a new initiative for Hobhouse, and it is interesting to reflect on why she undertook this venture at this juncture, particularly given that the schools were run in absentia and Hobhouse herself never set. Letters from the Times suggest that Hobhouse felt excluded from the running of the spinning schools once they were controlled by the government. She felt that this official control had what she had called a deadening effect. So it seemed that the lace school offered her the opportunity to revive her original vision, in which the schools were not simply there to provide employment and education, but were also designed to inculcate moral virtue and independence, as suggested by the following comments. It is refining and educative, for it demands patience, extreme cleanliness, absolute thoroughness, delicacy of workmanship, and an appreciation of outline and design. Complete command of the needle is a matter of course. A girl gains in moral qualities as well as skill, and she could produce an hour of art which, though not a livelihood, will bring pocket money. This perhaps helps to explain the choice of lace making, time-consuming, highly skilled, highly decorative rather than functional. For the imperative was to address the so-called poor white economic security, but also, and most importantly, to provide an education in virtue. For Hobhouse, the home industries were clearly highly implicated in ideas of race in South Africa, not simply in the sense that the native races were excluded, but also in the sense that whiteness was a category that had to be reinforced. The fear was that white Boers who had been impoverished by the war were in danger of slipping down the social hierarchy. A recurring theme across Hobhouse's letters to Johanna Root is the ongoing difficulty the lace school experienced in recruiting Boer girls to train in lace making, and particularly recruiting the right kind of girl. Responding to Johanna Root and Lucia Storace's apparent concerns about the recruitment of suitable girls to train, Hobhouse remarked in 1910, "A good general tell each year. She will be by instinct and by study learn how to marshal these forces and out of them form an efficient army of workers, giving to each what they can best do. Tell her from me that to drop the rano, a highly complicated and intricate lace, will be a vast mistake, though it may have to be kept in abeyance till the right workers, especially for that, and made to stick to it." For Hobhouse, the didactic quality of the lace school is evident in an earlier letter to Johanna Root in 1909. How are you getting on? It is an anxious time for you and all, and for you in particular, this commencement of the work and outlining the scheme. I say for you in particular because, Johanna, I'm depending mainly on you to carry this enterprise to a successful issue. You pass through a sore and stormy time, but that is training, being ground in a mill, so to say. And you came out the other side quite different. And someday you'll be glad I was stern, and you will recognise it to do special work, use special training. And now I look to you for the result. And it will take time. Rome was not built in a day. Patience, mistakes will be made. Prudence, look before you leap. Pluck, never be discouraged. Economy, take care of the pence, etc.
This emphasis on teaching moral values were part of a wider social and political philosophy of promoting the liberal values of self-reliance, economy, and independence. These were values current in progressive circles at this time, in which the revival of craft traditions would bring greater social democracy. And these are ideas often associated with William Morris, who Hobhouse names as a key influence. However much Hobhouse viewed her work as progressive, in practice, the lace school in South Africa at Korpies was deeply conservative, evoking feudal relationships, including the cloistering of young women, and suggestive of the pre-industrial apprentice system. We think the stress on sensibility and virtue is why Hobhouse felt aggrieved by her exclusion from discussions about the government-run home industry school, now under the control of General Herzog, who was an advocate for racial segregation, for she felt such work could not be standardized or treated in a utilitarian manner, could not, for instance, be taught in a uniform fashion for a few hours a week. In a further letter to Root, she emphasized that lace making was much more than producing items for sale, but an immersive, dedicated art of creating the ideal liberal self. So she comments, "I do not wish to pronounce judgment of any kind upon General Herzog's schemes. Of course, I'm interested to hear, but you can realize it is not my business to criticize. Only this, I would warn you to recollect what I've constantly emphasized, that it is no good learning lace as an adjunct to other things. It must be treated professionally, not dabbled with. And when girls are doing it for 5 or 6 hours a day, that is considerable work and not much else can be expected." And again, in a later letter, Hobhouse imagined lace making to be the bourgeois pastime of an old elite, but failed to consider that for many Boer girls, the reality was of rural farm life with little time for leisure or hobbies or artistic endeavor. So we can see the later quote where she writes, "Another principle is not to inculcate or expect that girls can earn a whole livelihood from hand industries, but only pocket money when an article is finished. It is to give occupation in the home, consonant with the usual duties of home or farm life, refining, educative and artistic in nature, but not intended to furnish a livelihood." Hobhouse's bourgeois liberal Victorian views found much in common with the generation of Boer leaders who had fought in the South African War, who idealized the traditions of the farmstead, with all the conservative, gender and racial politics this embodied. However, her vision was criticized by some at the time, who felt her scheme was regressive and that women in the 20th century in South Africa needed standard education, professional opportunities, and the protection of trade unions. For example, the South African writer and political commentator Olive Schreiner noted in her friend Alice Green, who was a strong supporter of Hobhouse's home industries scheme, "Don't think I'm so narrow that because I don't see the way to women's economic salvation lies in the direction of handwork, that I can't sympathize with one who finds joy and beauty in doing it. I think weaving must be most delightful, far better than most other kinds of fancy work, in the beauty of the things one is able to produce." So with her lace school, Hobhouse invented traditions for a new nation, which attempted to create national motifs and symbolism, while also drawing on the moral codes of older European aesthetics. One design associated with Hobhouse and the school was the Wachabiki, which translates as wait a bit and is the name of a South African tree, while the name and symbol alludes to the South African adage of take your time or have patience. In this image, we can see a collar designed by Hobhouse using the Wachabiki design, and it is now on display at the Anglo-Boer War Museum in Bloemfontein in South Africa. This museum is a relic of the days of Afrikaner nationalism, and in its grounds is the monument to the women and children who died in the concentration camps. That is, the Boer women and children. Black women and children who died in the camps did not get memorialized until after the end of apartheid. At the foot of the monument, which you can see on the slide, the ashes of Emily Hobhouse were interred after her death, which shows the extent to which she was seen as a heroine of the nation. In this context of largely rural society, emerging from a war with problems of poverty and facing economic and political reconstruction, there seems something strikingly incongruous about starting a lace school dedicated to the production of lace, given that it was so highly specialized, a decorative arts and a luxury product. However, we think it's absolutely indicative of her vision that she wished to bring to South Africa the very best European cultural traditions as she saw it, and not simply the aesthetics, but also the ethics she imagined to be woven into its production. In this way, Hobhouse was encouraging the performance of Europeanness, of a polite and civilized society in the South African context. So for all Schreiner's criticisms of the scheme as regressive, it was for this very reason that it appealed to Boer leaders such as Mrs. Steyn, for it was a civilizing mission directed at poor whites just at this moment of colonial nationalism, as the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910 and represented the creation of an ethnic identity. The lace school itself eventually closed in 1938 after years of ongoing financial difficulties, and the site was turned into an old people's home where some of the former pupils of the school retired, and where today some of the lace produced by the school is on display alongside this bust of Hobhouse. A memorial to the lace school was unveiled in the town of Korpies in 1968. You could just make that out in the image. In curating an exhibition on Hobhouse in South Africa for our project, part of the challenge for us was to think through the cultural politics of South Africa and how to redeploy and redisplay these same textiles today. One of the unexpected parts of our project has been finding that many of these textiles are in storage or imperiled. But in seeking to recover and exhibit these textiles, we've been mindful that there's a need to grapple with the racial politics woven into their history, with how Hobhouse has been lionized in South Africa as a heroine, and without apologizing for her, to try to understand Hobhouse's vision for the new South African nation and how that was woven into these textiles. Thank you very much for listening to our paper.